Some songs only get one shot, one record, one moment, one chance to be heard. In the 1970s, reggae was taking over the world, and some artists lit up the charts, then vanished.
Now pop, no stop, I strictly roots.
But here's the question nobody asks. Did the music die, or did the world just stop paying attention? 10 songs, 10 stories. True fans never forgot them. This is the top 10 1970s reggae one-hit wonders we'll never forget. Number 10, Boris Gardner, Elizabethan Reggae. (1970), close your eyes and picture this. You are standing in a record shop in 1970, maybe it's on Portobello Road in London, maybe it's in Kingston, Jamaica. The needle drops, and what comes out of those speakers makes absolutely no sense, and every bit of sense at the same time. It's a classical melody, something old, something that sounds like it belongs in a ballroom in the 1600s, but underneath it, there's a reggae groove, steady, warm, undeniable. You don't know whether to laugh or just stand there with your mouth open. Most people chose to stand there. Boris Gardner was no amateur. He was a serious musician, a band leader, a session player who knew his way around a studio. He released Elizabethan Reggae in 1970 on the Duke label in the UK. The track took a classical piece, the Elizabethan Serenade, originally composed by Ronald Binge, and turned it into a smooth, rolling reggae instrumental. It cracked the UK top 20 and caught people completely off guard. Nobody had heard reggae do something like this before. It was playful, it was sophisticated, it was proof that reggae could go anywhere it wanted to go. Here's the thing that makes this even more interesting. Boris Gardner was not done. In 1986, 16 years later, he came back and had a massive UK #1 with a song called I Wanna Wake Up With You, which technically makes him more than a one-hit wonder. But internationally, in the 1970s, this was his moment. And what a moment it was. Reggae fans in the 1970s were hungry for roots, for Rastafari, for messages about struggle and liberation. An instrumental based on a classical melody was a strange fit for that movement, even if it was beautifully made. It got lost in the shuffle as reggae grew heavier and more spiritual. It deserved better, because it showed just how creative and open reggae really was at its foundation. If number 10 surprised you, wait until you hear what number 9 did to a soul classic from across the Atlantic. Number 9, Horace Faith, Black Pearl, 1970.
Black Pearl, precious little girl, you've been in the...
This one is smooth. This one is warm. This one feels like a late summer evening where everything has gone quiet and the only sound is music drifting through an open window. Black Pearl is a lover's anthem with a reggae heartbeat. It doesn't rush, it doesn't shout. It just pulls you in close and holds you there. The song was originally recorded by Sonny Charles and the Checkmates in 1969 as an American soul record. Horace Faith, a Jamaican vocalist who had been working in the UK music scene, took that melody and gave it a full reggae treatment. His version came out in 1970 on the Trojan label, and it worked. It climbed into the UK top 20. British audiences fell in love with it. The warmth in Faith's voice made the song feel deeply personal, like he wasn't singing to a crowd. He was singing to one person. And that connection? You felt it the moment the music started? Horace Faith had been working the UK blues dance circuit for years before this track broke. He knew how to read a room, he knew how to hold a note, but the mainstream industry never gave him the follow-up support he needed. This was his shot, and he took it beautifully. The Trojan Records system in the early 1970s was extraordinary at breaking acts, but notoriously poor at building long-term careers. Artists would get one release, one push, and if it didn't lead to an album campaign with proper distribution, the momentum died. Horace Faith fell into that gap. He deserved a full album, a proper tour, a second chance. The industry moved too fast and he got left behind. Number 8 is a story about a country song, yes. Yeah, a country that became a reggae anthem for working people everywhere.
All right, C-Trends fam, let's keep it real. We're pouring our hearts into bringing you the best celebrity news and music deep dives. But check it, a massive 98% of you aren't subscribed yet. Subscribing is how you can truly support us, helping us grow and create even better content. If you're vibing with what we do, take a sec to hit that subscribe button. It's free and makes a huge difference. Plus, ring that notification bell so you never miss out. Let's flip that 98% and build this C-Trends family together. Your support is everything.
Number 8, Nicky Thomas, Love of the Common People, 1970. Imagine you are working a long shift. Your back hurts. Your pockets are nearly empty. The week has been hard. And then this song comes on the radio and suddenly everything feels a little lighter. That is what Love of the Common People does to you. It doesn't pretend life is easy, but it makes you feel like the struggle is worth something. Like ordinary people matter, like your story matters. The song was written by John Hurley and Ronnie Wilkins and first recorded by Waylon Jennings as a country track in the late 1960s. Nicky Thomas, a reggae vocalist from Jamaica, transformed it completely. His version dropped in 1970 and reached the UK top 10. It connected with working-class audiences in Britain in a way that felt almost spiritual. The lyrics speak about a father working hard, a mother praying, and children growing up with dignity despite having very little. In 1970, Britain, where Jamaican immigrants were living those exact realities, the song hit different. It wasn't just a pop record, it was a mirror. Nicky Thomas recorded the track with Joe Gibbs in Jamaica. Joe Gibbs was one of the most important producers in the country, a man who understood how to build a groove that could travel. The production on this record is clean, open, and perfect. For a voice like Thomas's, every note has room to breathe. After this single, Nicky Thomas never found the same international footing. Part of it was distribution, part of it was the shift in reggae's identity as roots culture deepened and artists like Burning Spear and Culture took center stage. Thomas's gentle, uplifting style didn't fit the heavier direction the music was heading, but his heart was in every word of this song. And if you listen to it today, really listen, you'll hear exactly why it mattered so much in 1970. Number 7 brings us a UK reggae act that took a pop song and turned it into something that still sounds fresh more than 50 years later. Number 7, Greyhound, Black and White, 1971.
The ink is black, the page is white.
together.
Picture a sound system night in South London, 1971. The air is thick, people are pressed close together, and when this record drops, this bouncy, irresistible reggae groove, the whole room moves as one.
Learn to read and write, to read.
Black and White is a feel-good record in the truest sense. It's light on its feet, it's got this rolling energy that refuses to let you stand still. And the message behind it, unity, togetherness, breaking down color lines, was bold for its time.
If child is
Greyhound was a UK reggae group fronted by vocalist Danny Smith. They took the song Black and White, a pop track that had been floating around the music world, and gave it a proper reggae feel. The single came out in 1971 on the Trojan label and reached the UK top 10.
if child is white, the whole world looks up.
In a Britain that was still deeply divided along racial lines, where black communities faced daily discrimination and hostility, a song about unity had real weight. Greyhound weren't just making a pop record, they were making a statement.
On the side, a beautiful side.
The group had a few minor follow-up releases, but nothing approached the reach of this single. What's remarkable is that they were a UK-based act, not Jamaican, which meant they were already bridging two worlds just by existing.
And now a child.
They understood both the British experience and the reggae tradition, and this song is where those two things fused perfectly.
Can understand this is the law of
Greyhound never built a strong album identity. The singles market was brutal. In the early 1970s, you were only as good as your last release, and without a sustained run of hits, acts like this slipped out of the conversation even as their music held up.
the land.
But pull this song out at any oldies session today and watch what happens. The floor fills up every single time.
The world is black, the world is white.
Number 6 went to number 1 in the UK, a proper chart topper, and the organ riff on this record is one of the most recognizable sounds in the history of reggae. Number 6, Dave and Ansel Collins, Double Barrel, 1971. You know this one, even if you don't think you know it, you know it. That organ. That rolling, stuttering, irresistible organ riff that crawls into your head and refuses to leave. It is one of the most infectious sounds ever put to tape. This is not soft music. This has pressure, this has swagger, this is a sound system weapon, the kind of record that would clear a floor and then fill it back up within 30 seconds. Double Barrel was produced by Clancy Eccles and released in 1971. It went straight to number 1 in the UK charts, beating everything else in the country that week, not just in the reggae chart, the national chart. Number 1.
Work it on, baby.
Dave Barker handled the vocals, rapid fire, cocky, full of personality. Ansel Collins was the keyboard genius behind that organ line. Now, the two of them together created something that sounded unlike anything else on the radio at the time. Reggae was announcing itself to the mainstream in the biggest way possible. Shortly after Double Barrel hit number 1, the duo also charted with a follow-up called Monkey Spanner, which technically makes them a 2-hit act rather than a pure one-hit wonder. But here's the truth, Double Barrel is the one that changed everything. Monkey Spanner rode the wave, Double Barrel created it.
Work it up on me now.
Part of the reason this era gets overlooked is that early 1970s reggae was eventually buried by the roots movement on one side and the pop crossover market on the other. The raw, rhythmic energy of a track like Double Barrel didn't fit neatly into either category. But as a snapshot of what reggae could do, its power, its confidence, its refusal to apologize for being itself, Double Barrel remains absolutely essential.
The spot.
Number 5 takes us deeper into the roots. This next artist was a respected insider in Jamaica, but internationally, one hypnotic track was all the world ever got from him. Number 5, Rupee Edwards, Ire Feelings, also known as Skanga, 1974.
Skanga, 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 skanga. What will you do, skanga?
This one has a different energy to everything we've heard so far. This isn't pop-influenced reggae. This isn't a cover version. This is something raw, something more spiritual, something that feels like it came straight out of the earth.
Skanga, 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 skanga. Then you
Ire Feelings is the kind of track that slows everything down, the kind of track that makes you close your eyes and just feel it. There's a chant at the heart of it, a rhythm that loops and builds until it becomes almost meditative.
You wouldn't even try to reach the top.
Rupee Edwards was not an outsider. In Jamaica, he was a well-known producer and recording artist who had been active since the late 1960s. He ran his own label Success and had his hands in a lot of important music, but internationally, this track was the one that broke through.
You wouldn't even try to reach the top.
That it was released in 1974 and climbed to the UK top 10. For a lot of British listeners, it was their first introduction to a raw, more chant-driven side of reggae, something that pointed toward the deeper roots sound that was about to dominate the second half of the decade.
Then you will see every day.
Rupee Edwards was actually one of Jamaica's most prolific reversioners, meaning he would take a rhythm and cut multiple songs over it with different artists. Skanga was both a hit and a rhythm that spawned a whole family of tracks in Jamaica. The international hit was just one branch of a much bigger creative tree.
I'm feeling high.
Despite the UK chart success, Edwards never received the follow-up push that might have built a wider international profile. He was more interested in his production work back in Jamaica than in chasing overseas audiences.
So high.
And that integrity cost him mainstream recognition, but it earned him deep respect within the music. He made the music he believed in. The charts were almost a side effect.
Branga, 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 branga.
Coming up, we are going inside one of the most legendary recording studios in the history of Jamaican music, and the story around number 4 is one that has never been fully told the way it deserves to be. Number 4, Junior Mervin, Police and Thieves, 1976.
Police and thieves in the street.
Kingston, Jamaica, 1976. Election season, political gangs, gunshots in the night. Into that reality, Junior Mervin walked into Lee Perry's Black Ark studio and recorded one of the most haunting songs ever made. That falsetto high, aching, ghostly. It wasn't fiction, it was happening outside the door.
Fight of the nation with.
Produced by Lee Perry in 1976, the track became a hit in Jamaica, and the UK Mervin's falsetto was unlike anything else on the radio, fragile and powerful at the same time. It spoke directly to the chaos and fear of life in Kingston that year.
Guns and ammunitions.
When The Clash covered Police and Thieves on their debut album in 1977, it reached a massive new audience. And that mattered for reggae's visibility, but here's where it gets complicated.
Police and thieves in the street. Oh yeah.
Some people in the reggae community felt uneasy about the way punk acts were adopting Jamaican music at that time. There were real questions about who was benefiting commercially, real questions about credit and money.
Scaring the nation with their.
In interviews, there have been different versions of how Junior Murvin and Lee Perry felt about it. Some accounts suggest pride, others suggest frustration that black artists were providing the raw material, while white acts got the mainstream shine. The truth probably sits somewhere in the middle. What nobody disputes is that Junior Murvin and Lee Perry made something extraordinary, but the world moved on without giving Murvin the career he deserved. The industry takes what it needs. Sometimes the people who created the fire never get warm from it. Number 3, a woman walks into the Black Ark studio for the very first time. No experience, and she makes one of the most sensual records in reggae history. Number 3, Susan Cadogan, Hurt So Good, 1975. If you were at a blues dance in London in 1975 and this came on, the room changed, everything slowed down. Couples moved closer together, the bass settled in low, and that voice, warm, intimate, almost whispering, floated over everything. Hurt So Good is a lovers rock record. Before lovers rock had a name, it is soft and sensual and deeply human. It is the kind of song that makes you feel something in your chest rather than just in your feet. Susan Cadogan, real name Allison Cadogan, was a librarian in Kingston, Jamaica when Lee Perry discovered her. Let that sink in for a second. A librarian working in a library, and Lee Perry heard something in her voice that he knew the world needed to hear. He brought her into the Black Ark, and the result was Hurt So Good. Were released in 1975 on the Magnet label in the UK, it reached number 4 on the UK pop charts. Number 4, a reggae record by a first-time artist who had never been in a professional studio before. It was remarkable. The song was based on a Northern Soul track by Lolieta Holloway. Lee Perry took that framework, stripped it back, rebuilt it with his signature Black Ark reverb and depth, and then let Susan Cadogan's voice do the rest. What came out the other side was something that didn't sound like the original. It sounded like something entirely new. Susan Cadogan never received the follow-up campaign her debut deserved. Lee Perry was a visionary, but not a conventional music industry operator. He was more interested in the next creative experiment than in managing an artist's career trajectory. After the success of Hurt So Good, the momentum simply wasn't sustained. She went back to her life in Jamaica. The mainstream moved on. But every single person who hears this record for the first time has the same reaction. They can't believe they hadn't heard it before. Number 2 is a song that hit number 1 in the UK for 3 weeks. A song originally written as a tribute to a dead father, and a Jamaican voice that turned it into something that made an entire country feel their grief. Number 2, Ken Booth, Everything I Own, 1974.
You sheltered me from harm.
There are voices in reggae that are technically impressive, and then there are voices that reach into you. Ken Booth has one of those voices, rich, controlled, full of emotion he doesn't try to hide. When he sings, you believe every single word.
Kept me warm.
Everything I Own is a song about loss, about the person you love so much that you'd give up everything, every material thing you own, just to have them back. Whether that person is a lover or someone you've lost forever, the song finds you wherever you are.
You gave my life to me.
The song was written by David Gates of the American soft rock group Bread. Gates reportedly wrote it as a tribute to his father who had passed away. The original version was gentle and smooth, a pop record.
Set me free. Set me free.
Ken Booth's reggae version, released in 1974, transformed it. It went to #1 in the UK for 3 weeks. 3 weeks at the top of the national charts. The production, helmed by Lloyd Charmers, gave it space and warmth.
The finest tears I ever.
And Booth's voice turned what was already an emotional song into something almost unbearable in the best way. You could not listen to it without feeling something.
All the years.
Ken Booth was already a respected name in Jamaica with a deep catalog of rock-steady and early reggae recordings going back to the late 1960s. He was not an unknown artist, he was a seasoned professional. But internationally, this was the moment the world discovered him. The tragedy is that the world didn't do enough with that discovery. After Everything I Own, Booth had a few more UK chart entries, but never repeated the impact of this record internationally.
I own, give up my life.
His Jamaican work remained prolific and deeply respected, but the mainstream, as it so often does, was looking for the next thing rather than nurturing what it had.
My heart, my own, and I will.
If you have never heard Ken Booth's catalog beyond this song, please do yourself the favor. There is a lifetime of incredible music there. This was just the door.
Give anything I own.
And now, #1, Two Teenage Girls. Their first record ever, and one of the greatest chart stories in the history of reggae music.
All right, C-Trends fam, let's keep it real. We're pouring our hearts into bringing you the best celebrity news and music deep dives. What? Check it. A massive 98% of you aren't subscribed yet. Subscribing is how you can truly support us, helping us grow and create even better content. If you're vibing with what we do, take a sec to hit that subscribe button. It's free and makes a huge difference. Plus, ring that notification bell so you never miss out. Let's flip that 98% and build this C-Trends family together. Your support is everything.
#1, Althea and Donna. Uptown top ranking, 1977.
In my heels and ting. Them checks say we hip and ting.
UK #1 in January 1978. Two girls, 17 and 18 years old. No management, no label backing, no experience, just confidence, youth, and something to say. They walked into a studio, and what they created that day went to #1 in the United Kingdom.
True them no know and ting. We have them going and ting.
Althea Forrest and Donna Reed recorded Uptown top ranking at Joe Gibbs's studio in Kingston in 1977, produced by Errol Thompson. The song was a playful, sharp answer to Trinity's three-piece suit, two young women declaring their identity on their own terms.
Nah pop, no style. I strictly.
The rhythm was undeniable. In January 1978, it hit #1 in the UK, their debut record, the biggest chart position in the country.
Nah pop, no style. I strictly.
When they appeared on Top of the Pops, they carried themselves with a natural confidence that felt completely genuine, because it was. But they weren't performing stardom, they just were who they were.
See me on the road and you not call out to me. Do you see me?
The industry didn't know what to do with them. Too young, too fresh, too real. No follow-up campaign came. They returned to their lives in Jamaica. The machine that could have built careers around artists like this simply wasn't built for what they were. That is a failure of the industry, not of Althea and Donna.
Roots. Watch out, we chuck it and ting. In our car.
But 50 years later, when that rhythm starts and those voices come in, the joy is still completely, perfectly intact. That is number one, and if that story doesn't move you, nothing will.